There's a lot of people in art and music who made a career out of sort of like going against the grain in that way socially. Well, this pisses the greatest amount of people off, so I'm going to do this. And I remember we went in the house, he sat me down, and immediately he was watching Alex Jones. And, you know, you got to watch this guy. This guy's like, he knows what's going on.
Yeah.
You know, and immediately after, like, he bought a bunch of guns and so on and so forth. But like, you know, as you do. But,
As one does.
you know, we can't be looking at Spotify and looking at Joe Rogan as like, yeah, they're the underdogs, man. If you actually like capitalism and you think capitalism is great and you want capitalism to continue, like, the best thing that you could possibly hope for is a Bernie Sanders.
Is a New Deal. Welcome to Doomscroll. I'm your host, Joshua Citarella. My guest is Anthony Fantano, a music critic and the voice behind the needle drop.
You know, the thing is, like, look at a guy like Mark Zuckerberg, for example. That motherfucker, he doesn't, you know, hop onto social media to make this video about like, oh, you know, we're going to do an update to, you know, our fact-checking policy and free speech and so on and so forth. He doesn't do that and then go on Joe Rogan simply because like he has no bias and he has no, you know, personal, you know, vested interest in how all of these things politically are playing out right now. You know, he does. And he wants to put as much money in his pocket as possible.
Donated to Trump's inauguration.
Exactly. You know, he wants to put as much money in his pocket as possible, as does every other tech CEO.
Why is he doing Z-Pain, though? What is the fucking motivation behind that?
I think he has money and he's bored.
Yes,
and, you know, unfortunately, like a lot of these tech people, that's all that they are. They're bored people with a lot of money that, like, when you actually do see them try to put themselves into any sort of like creative space or do anything that would actually reflect sort of what's in their soul in some way, what comes out is like some stupid, dumb bullshit parody song of a track that they've only sort of like, you know, held on to personally on some level because like it meant something to them in college.
Right.
And that's probably a time that they think back to. They're like, I was actually happy then. And I was like kind of a human and I was like fulfilled on some level.
Yeah.
You know, whereas like now their life is just like some, you know, just big corporate jerk off where, you know, they just exist to accrue as much wealth as possible, which, you know, is a lot less fun than Lil Jon's Get Low.
How much of today's political chaos do you think is a result of the ongoing, unfolding political crisis? And how much of it is this product of algorithms and social media?
If we're talking about root problems here, I don't know if I would attribute much of any of the political chaos on social media.
Yeah.
Because
people will say that. They'll say it's social media's fault.
The political chaos comes from dissatisfaction and comes from a lack of needs being met. That's where the chaos comes from. That's the source of the chaos. It comes from needs not being met. It comes from dissatisfaction. It comes from inequity, and it comes from people essentially being put in a position where they see no hope or future for themselves. And, you know, society broadly. Combine that with the fact there's like just a broad lack of trust in the media, cultural institutions, so on and so forth. That's the source of all of it. That's 110% the source of all of it. Social media, and this is not inherent. This is the way that it works through algorithms and the way that, you know, I mean, just think of the way that Elon Musk has essentially turned, you know, especially over the course of the election, Twitter into a big right-wing billboard. Beyond that, social media is not the tool, but a tool, one of many, that essentially just sort of like, you know, takes that dissatisfaction that people have and either numbs it, distracts from it, or takes people's, you know, dissatisfaction with that system and sort of diverts it into, oh, here's the actual problem. Here's the actual issue. Here's something you should focus on instead. Oh, you're fully aware, not fully aware, but you were at least on some level aware that there's a problem going on in society. There's something that's lacking. There's an issue. There's some kind of shortcoming going on. We're going to tell you what the issue is. Here it is, you know, when in fact, you know, it's a diversion. It's a red herring. It's a dead end. You know, I feel like social media and, you know, other media pipelines that just sort of serve to explain falsely, you know, what the fixes are. They all sort of like contribute to a fracturing of what could potentially be any kind of like collectivized effort to fix the problem, fix the issue, sort of eliminate any kind of like greater, broader cultural collectivization and consciousness and turn us against each other instead. And I don't mean that in sort of like it's not even I know that sounds conspiratorial, but it's not even a conspiracy. Like it literally is happening before your very eyes through the rhetoric of, Donald Trump and our political parties and so on and so forth. Anything that sort of like, causes you to focus instead on something that is not the powerful.
Yeah.
And even, a conversation about who and what is powerful is fragmented and fractured. There are some circles when you have, those terms getting thrown out, the first things that people think of is like Hillary Clinton, George Soros, so on and so forth.
All the supporters of the show.
Those people are no doubt powerful. But the thing is, like, those are not the only powerful people in society, and they're not the only people who are making decisions that are not to your benefit. Elon Musk is literally the richest man on the planet, and is currently tearing apart multiple parts of our government with no accountability whatsoever. If you actually care about taking on power and preventing people with it from manipulating, our government in ways that are to your detriment, you have to apply that point of view across the board. You have to apply it to conversations and situations when, Elon Musk is doing what I just said. You have to apply it to conversations and situations when Hillary Clinton is up there on the stump being like, universal healthcare is never going to pass anyway. And it's like, well, screw you. It's like, honestly, it's a middle finger to both of those people, for different reasons and in different situations. And, maybe my fist is a little more clenched when I throw that finger up in one instance than another, but it's still a middle finger in both cases. And, I think there's a lack of understanding, or a lack of focus, collectively speaking, in terms of like who the bad guys are, who is actually working to change things for the better. That, again, I feel like the ultimate sort of like, goal and intention for a lot of these platforms and anybody who's running them, is to silo and fragment people off so that they're so holed up into, their own worldview and their own thoughts, sometimes, can be pretty extreme depending on what your algorithm is looking like, that you won't even for a second sort of like, consider somebody who's on the other side or of a different perspective to be like you in any way,
right?
Or be somebody who you could work with for a greater good. There's an othering going on, and it's like, this person is my enemy. And, for sure, when it comes to things like, the rise of, fascism, for example, like, there are definitely political enemies out there. Like, not everybody is your friend. Not everybody can be worked with.
Sure.
There are some people who are just like too far gone. But, I think there's like a bit of an overemphasis on social media and in the media generally on just how many people are like, that far down the rabbit hole.
Do you imagine that there's someone in your audience who has the opposite political worldview of you, knows you for your music reviews, and is plainly unaware of your other commentary that exists elsewhere?
Oh yeah, that's a lot of people. Honestly, I mean, the music reviews, depending on how much engagement or likes or whatever that they get, they're being exposed to and thrown in front of the faces of people who really have no context for me whatsoever. It's on the videos on like the Fantano channel, for example, where I am doing a lot of that industry commentary that I often find that people are like the most familiar with everything that I'm doing. That's where I feel like a lot of my most condensed audience is kind of there for the most part. Whereas when you kind of like are getting into the music reviews, a lot of the people who are watching each video much of the time aren't even the same audience. You have people who are like kind of strictly dedicated to just watching the reviews of the artists that they're most familiar with.
Sure.
And then beyond that, they kind of like subdivert even further into like, I just sort of watch the reviews that deal in the specific genre I'm the most interested in. I just mostly watch the hip hop reviews, or I just mostly watch the pop reviews, or I just mostly watch the rock reviews or the, the occasional jazz or singer-songwriter review or whatever that I might cover, here and there. While the main channel does tend to get the most views, the viewership in terms of who's coming to what video and for what reason, it's a lot more fragmented.
Sure.
Whereas just kind of the general social music industry commentary, type stuff that I do on the side too, the audience with that is a bit more consistent.
In reference to your political background, did you grow up in a red or a blue household?
My parents split up when I was very young, and the answer to that is that it kind of shifted. When I was younger, my mom was very conservative, and she's said this to me multiple times. Like when I was a teenager and very sort of like, when I was talking about that period earlier, I was like, very anti the Iraq War and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think anybody heard about it more than my mom did. And I eventually, like over the course of a few years, like I pretty much argued her into being.
Oh, you convinced her?
Oh yeah. Yeah. No,
Oh,
I did.
nice.
No, I did.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And she's like still very left wing to this day.
I was just probably grateful for that, actually.
Oh yeah, she is. So I actually did, I did change her mind. But I mean, going into that though, my mom was already like a very well-read woman, and she wasn't necessarily like being hip to too many more things that she wasn't already aware of, especially during that time period. I feel like for a lot of older people, it was easy to sort of just kind of feed into the jingoistic, sort of like fear mongering, especially after the terrorist attack and everything. So, it was kind of like a bit of a light deprogramming, I would more or less say. My dad is a lot more difficult to sort of like define politically, I would say, in maybe not necessarily the best way, but he was like most definitely ahead of his time. I feel like if my dad had maybe been born with like the same perspective, if he had maybe been born several years after I was and sort of like came up during that same time period, he probably would have turned into like a nihilistic 4chan shit poster.
Oh, really?
Like, complete like social media edgelord.
Okay.
Like he, at that point.
Like in a bad way or a good way?
Is there a good way to be a 4chan nihilistic shit poster?
I guess not now.
No, I mean,
but I think back to like 2011 or so, like 4chan was like Occupy Wall Street, anonymous.
There was
something.
I see what you're saying. No, I mean in terms of like your usual social media edgelord now.
Yeah.
Not like hacker against the system, whatever.
Yeah.
Like I remember, again, this is a point in time where I was really like sort of pretty radical for a teenager and very sort of like open and in your face about sort of like my politics.
Yeah.
And my dad, I feel like a lot of people have like, their perception of kind of like your usual conservative dad who, loves God and apple pie and so on and so forth, and is going to force like, their kid to, sort of think this way or whatever. And my dad was like, his reaction to me just feeling that way was like, what are you doing? What's the point? He's like, all these politicians, they don't even care. It's like, this system doesn't even function. It's like, he just had a pure sort of like political nihilism about him.
Yeah.
And he was just completely out there for himself, had no sort of like collective consciousness about much of anything outside of like, he was a part of a union where he worked.
Oh, wow.
But like, he wasn't super staunchly sort of like, labor in terms of like his perspective, like forceful conservative posturing in terms of like, hoisting your morals out there and that sort of thing. But he also hated environmental organizations too.
Oh, wow.
Like, yeah, he hated environmentalists and hippies, and he hated, black activists, and he hated conservative. He hated all of them.
Wow.
Like
at least he's fair. He hates everyone
he saw
the same.
Complete futility in any and all political action in any way. And another way in which he was ahead of his time was that the day 9/11 happened, like a lot of people, to go pick up your kids from school, you're totally freaked out, total emergency. And I remember we went in the house, he sat me down, and immediately he was watching Alex Jones. And, and in his and Alex Jones's defense, this is a totally different era of Alex Jones.
Oh, that's true, actually.
But with that being said, he was like, you got to watch this guy. This guy's like, he knows what's going on. Da, 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 da.
Yeah.
You know, and immediately after, like, he bought a bunch of guns and so on and so forth. But like, you know, as you do. But
as one does,
you know, like just right there, you know. So, but that's the thing. Like he was of that sort of like political mindset that he could be, at least in some way. Now he didn't go down like an Alex Jones rabbit hole or whatever. And by the time Alex Jones like was you know, doing stuff like talking about the Sandy Hook shooting, he'd actually even forgotten that he had ever watched him or told me to sort of like check him out. It's kind of funny. But you know, with that being said, he really was kind of that mindset of it's all bad, to where he could be at least a little bit usurped by a guy who's like, yeah, I'm just totally outside the power structure. No, I'm against the corporate elites. I'm against all control. Da, 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 da. And you know, again, in that way, he did sort of very easily buy into sort of like this false kind of prophet perception of like, you know, I'm the truth teller. I'm totally outside the system. And, you know, I think that is in its own way a type of black and white thinking that you could become a victim of. You know, like you could easily become a victim of that perception if you end up feeding into the thoughts and notions of a complete psychopath based merely off the fact that like, oh, well, they're not corporate media. Right. Or they're independent. Not everybody who you see, especially these days on sort of like, you know, the internet alternative mediascape space, not everybody is on the level. And as it has been, you know, like recently, you know, revealed in FBI documentation, you know, figures like Tim Pool and Dave Rubin were like, you know, getting money from like, you know, a Russian billionaire on the back end for, you know, making content they were already making. Yeah, we're getting $100,000 per episode of Doomscroll. Oh, nice. Right now. Yeah, and you didn't offer me a single cent of it to come on and do this episode. That's fucking ridiculous. We're deeply in debt, actually. Yeah. Russian billionaires, if you're out there, we'd love. No, seriously, yeah, and I think that's really important if you look at the receipts on these things. That like all of these conservative guys are getting fucking hand over fist money. Yeah. And then all of the lefty people are like scraping by in crowdfunding. Yeah. Any figure that you're coming at from the internet with like a new set of eyes and a new perspective. I understand that for a long time, the internet, by virtue of it not being corporate media, you know, we're talking like early mid 2000s here, it was by virtue independent and alternative and different and providing a voice that you weren't hearing elsewhere. Yeah. And nowadays there is so much money to be made in internet content, and internet content has so much influence and power and, you know, virality potential to it, that it's a great deal of it has been bought and paid for at this point. Yes. You know, there are people who are still like listening to and looking at Joe Rogan. Like at this point, he hasn't gotten multiple multi-million-dollar contracts from fucking Spotify, which is $1 billion company. Right. You know, Spotify's value is like that of a major media corporation now. Yeah. You know, we can't be looking at Spotify and looking at Joe Rogan as like, yeah, they're the underdogs, man. You know, it's like Joe Rogan right now probably gets paid better than Anderson Cooper, you know, but we look at Anderson Cooper as like, oh yeah, he's like a corporate media sellout, whatever. And, you know, it's like, while sure, that is true, but the things that make him a corporate media sellout also make Joe Rogan a corporate media sellout. So the thing is like, you know, we need to sort of break down this false notion that like whatever we see on the internet that we see ourselves reflected in because the algorithm gives it to us and so on and so forth, that we, you know, agree with or get sort of siphoned into because we're sort of just like likely to enjoy it because social media has dictated. So that is like, you know, outside of kind of the corporate influence control bubble. You know, billionaires influence and own quite a bit of, you know, social media and trademark properties on the internet as well. Yeah. The internet is very lucrative. The internet in terms of influence and engagement is bigger than TV is now. Yeah. You know, we can't just simply, you know, take these opinions and perspectives that we have about the limitation of thought and the Overton window and so on and so forth and just apply them to TV and newspapers and radio. That is a very short-sighted way of viewing things, and honestly is a very kind of like old school way of viewing things. That's not updated. You need to update your brain to actually sort of like see a lot of what you're being fed on the internet as also being a part of that web. That's not power, you know, that's not like the kind of power, that's not the kind of influence, that's not the kind of control that decides whether or not you're going to eat tomorrow.
Right.
You know, that decides whether or not you have access to education or clean water or the things that actually impact your life in a profound and a significant way. Like, we're not just talking about like social dynamics here.
Yeah.
And that's what I think a lot of people sort of like misconstrue with power. Like, oh man, everybody got together and complained and now they can't put Aunt Jemima on the syrup bottle anymore. You know, that's not fucking power. Like that's a baby brained view of what power is. You know what I mean? This it's a very baby infantile view of power, because at the end of the day, is anybody's life really fucking impacted about whether or not Aunt Jemima is on the fucking syrup bottle? No. And the thing is, like, I know that sounds very funny and weird for me to bring up, but like,
it's a big deal to some people.
I just saw a meme about it yesterday.
I was thinking
on my Twitter, like I saw a meme. It was like Donald Trump. He opened the door and he's smiling.
Yeah.
And the person who was on the other side of the door smiling was Aunt Jemima. And I was like, these motherfuckers are still pissed about this? Like they're still thinking about Aunt Jemima?
I forgot about it until I saw the meme. Yeah.
You know, and the thing is, like, the reality, you know, for these motherfuckers is so twisted and sad and limited that they're still mad about, you know, gender fluid, you know, Mr. Potato Head or whatever. You know, they're still thinking about stuff like that. And again, that's not power. That's not like, you know, what actually impacts your quality of life in a profound way on an everyday basis. You need to be thinking bigger in terms of
slashing the corporate tax rate in half.
Right, exactly.
Mr. Potato Head is poisoning our children.
Right. You need to be thinking bigger in terms of the things that actually impact whether or not, if they changed radically in a month, you would die. Is what you need to be thinking about.
I always thought the irony of the Mr. and Mrs. Potato, however many potato heads they have, so you could just take off like the nose and the mouth and you could put the boy and the girl pieces on the different potato heads. Yeah. Like it was always implicit in the thing to begin with. Like that was the... Yeah, anyway, unimportant to even spend time on this, feels like a waste. On this topic of Kanye, there's some historical examples, artists in the past, like I think of Susie and the Banshees, David Bowie, who would use these kind of shock jock aesthetics, wearing a swastika on an armband or something. People will make similar arguments that Kanye is involved in some kind of like shock, outrage, publicity type of stunt. I disagree with this, but what would you say to people that make that argument that Kanye is trying to rile up controversy marketing or something?
Susie, as you just said, Gigi Allen, Sid Vicious, so on and so forth. Like, you know, these people were on an artistic mission of sorts. You know, you could argue that. I would argue it is, but it's also misguided, especially since Kanye right now is a living, breathing being who on multiple occasions since this recent crash out has gone on to explain himself, you know, in terms of like what his motivations are and what he's trying to do and what he's trying to achieve. Like, I would try to do your best to, as objectively as possible, in a plain black and white reading of whatever is being put in front of you, like actually try to read into the motivations of these individuals and why they're doing what they're doing. You know, like, is it because they're adhering to a particular ideology? Or is it because they're trying to get you to perceive or question things in a certain way? Like, what is their motivation? What are they trying to get you as the audience? You need to think about yourself as a member of the audience. And unfortunately, I feel like there's too much main character syndrome going around for anybody to sort of like think of themselves as like, you know, not the master of their own reality and sort of perceive, you know, themselves as being able to be influenced by somebody else or something else.
Yeah.
Like,
is that a social media phenomena? Because it didn't feel that way.
It's kind of maybe an influencer phenomenon. I don't know. But like, you know, this person's doing and saying and creating something and presenting in front of me. What are they trying to get me to think or perceive or say or react by doing that thing? You know, in the case of Kanye, he has said, you know, since these recent statements, that part of it is about sort of having control over what he wants to say and what he wants to do, which he has a proven track record of, you know, sort of like being kind of a contrarian, voice of sorts.
Sure.
He often seems like he wants to, touch the stove when, just merely because people are telling him not to. It's hot. You're going to get hurt. It's a bad idea. I will think this or that or whatever of you. I'll be disappointed if you go and do that. For some people, that's like temptation enough to be like, I'm going to do it anyway. Just like on the principle of having control over what I want to do. But simultaneously, he has posted, not just like a swastika or like Hitler's cool. He has posted genuine sentiments and ideas that do seem to voice like, ideas that, Jews are controlling money and hip hop and the media, and it gets quite conspiratorial and aggressive. And even if part of this on some level is about him believing he should be entitled to say whatever he wants to say, which I mean, that's always been the case. He's never not been entitled to that. The thing is, nobody is entitled to say whatever they want to say with no reaction to it. That's kind of the thing.
Adidas can decide that you're not good for business and you're saying crazy shit that costs us money.
Anybody could decide that anything that I'm saying in this interview is not good for them to have anything to do with, and then do whatever, and that's fine. It's like I'm saying what I'm saying in this interview right now with full knowledge that not everybody's going to like everything that I have to say. Not everybody's going to agree or want to work with me based on things that I'm saying. And that's just sort of like the repercussions that I take for saying whatever I say, not to insinuate that anything that I'm trying to get across is like the most crazy radical thing, but like, if you're putting thoughts and ideas and opinions out there, that could even be music opinions. There's going to be people who don't like them. And as a result, they're not going to watch you, or they're not going to mess with you, or they're not going to want to have anything to do with you. And that's fine. That's their right. That's my right. That's whatever. But that doesn't mean I should then start saying wild, offensive things that maybe on some level I don't even believe in, just to sort of like, make a point. What would the point even be? That I should be able to say whatever I want without people taking issue with it? Like, that's kind of the, that's, if I have the freedom to say whatever I want, people have the freedom to react to it however they want. That's kind of like, you can't have one without the other. It's like total freedom to say whatever while stripping others of their freedom to react. That's not free speech, and that's not advocacy for, free expression. That's the opposite. That's like, trying to create your own little dictatorship in terms of like, being able to dictate whatever you want and, hoist onto other people whatever you want without actually seeing any kind of pushback for it, which is, it again, is not reality.
There's a censorious quality to social media in the last few years. It's obviously very different now because we're getting rid of fact checkers. The parameters for political speech are wide open. There's all sorts of reprehensible things that are allowed on Twitter, for example. But I think of the era that we came up with, things like Marilyn Manson going on Bill O'Reilly. There was this like provocation that was shocking a conservative audience in many cases. And now Kanye, Marilyn Manson, all of these people are kind of right-wing coded as a result of feeling like they're under attack from large social media audiences. Did our generation maybe mistake that this transgression of language was necessarily left-wing coded? Was that always open to the right in some capacity?
I'll say specifically in regards to Marilyn Manson and that sort of era of like alternative art and speech and communication and so on and so forth. Like, we were still very much coming out of like the vestiges of like the PMRC, censorship in art and music type era that I was referring to earlier in regards to the dead Kennedys. Like, he was really kind of like the last breath, the last sort of like explosion of we've really hit like the peak here. We can't go any further down this road. I saw him perform at Ozfest and sodomize himself on stage, like when I was a teenager.
Wow.
Like, it was crazy.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like, at the time, I wouldn't say it was like ideologically coded or anything like that, but there was like a power dichotomy at play there in terms of like, generally speaking across the media and socially speaking, like what was allowed and what wasn't you know, Manson in his own way was advocating for greater freedom on that front.
Right.
You know, and at the time, you know, like the powers that be that were kind of like trying to constrict that as much as they possibly could, they were Christian organizations. They were PC corporate culture, you know, that wanted to make sure that, you know, whatever art that it advocated for, sold or shared was as bland or as unimaginative as possible in order to sort of like, you know, keep people from confronting.
Certainly wasn't that.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, whether he meant to or not, there was like, you know, something about what he was doing at the time that advocated for a greater amount of social freedom that I feel like a lot of people were kind of like seeing or experiencing at the time. And, you know, after that kind of era was ushered in, I feel like we kind of moved into a space in the 2000s, like the mid to late 2000s, where a lot of media consumers are becoming kind of jaded and nothing was shocking anymore.
Right.
You know? So it was kind of like,
just wait, we're going to get the internet soon.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, and I feel like it wasn't even just Marilyn Manson, but it was a lot of, you know, kind of the weirder, stranger, darker pockets of the internet at the time that were also sort of like desensitizing a lot of people to, you know, that sort of shock and awe that, you know, Americans might have had to a Marilyn Manson at the time. I think like, you know, early in the 2010s, that's what a lot of the content of a band like Death Grips was kind of like reflecting in their art at the time. You know, it's like, oh, I'm being exposed to like all this like weird, heinous, offensive, crazy stuff through the internet. And it's kind of like leading me to be kind of numb or, you know, whatever.
Is that why 4chan loves Death Grips? I've always wondered what that connection's about.
I mean, I feel like, you know, there is a lot of what they do aesthetically that kind of represents that, or is at least like, you know, it reflects that weird internet underbelly, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, at the time in the early 2010s, especially the music board on 4chan, like there was a very wide variety of different artists and bands that people were into. Death Grips was obviously one of them. And I think there was like, because there weren't as many avenues for general music discourse across like, you know, social media, outside of like, you know, other message boards and something like that, like a lot of it convened over there. And there was more of a healthy border between, you know, that sort of page and the rest of the website. And nowadays, like, you know, if people want to have genuine music discussions without having to sort of like go on the Japanese porn racist image board, they go on Reddit or they go on Twitter or they go on other more accessible spaces that the FBI is probably not logging your user information on nowadays. So as a result, like now a majority of the site has just been sort of like, you know, taken over by, you know, some of the worst people. And, you know, it's been bought and sold off since, you know, it was originally formed and everything. So it's kind of like, you know, lost a lot of its like luster culturally, I think.
On this topic of provocative artists, I feel like in this era of hyperpolarization, we have artists from either side where someone like Lil Nas X does a kind of, you know, shock for conservative audiences from the progressive side. And then there's people like, this is unfathomable for our generation, for people of our age. How does fucking Tom MacDonald exist?
Yeah.
Where did this come from?
Tom MacDonald exists for the reason that we were talking about earlier. People have a warped perception of power and power structures. And the biggest, scariest, ghouliest boogeyman that anybody, you know, sort of in Tom MacDonald's audience could think of is like some blue-haired queer them who is yelling at them about how, you know, they think there are only two genders. Like to them, that's the scariest, most powerful, most, you know, like freakiest thing that they could possibly think of.
It's not literally the richest man in the world.
Tom MacDonald is there to make music to confirm that worldview and be like, yeah, you know, there are enemies in society and that's the enemy. That's the biggest, scariest, you know, it's like if they were gone, if they disappeared tomorrow, there'd be no problems in society. Everything would be fixed. You know, the problem with the world right now, it's like, you know, people who aren't straight complaining about things that you don't even know what the fuck they're talking about. Like that's the biggest, scariest thing. So Tom MacDonald is there to sort of like feed into that warped perception and that misunderstanding of power structures. You know, it's essentially just feeding red meat to people who, again, the scariest thing to them is like a black person with an opinion, you know, that's like, you know, that sort of like, goes against their view that like, oh, we live in a post-racial society and I don't see color and so on and so forth. You know, it's this type of person who comes across a Tom McDonald song and is like, you know, I don't usually like hip hop, but this is my thing. I'm really enjoying this. You know, again, if you find yourself listening to Tom McDonald and you're like, man, I don't usually like rap, but that Tom McDonald, like, but you are a very shallow individual who has not been, you're quite sheltered. I'll say that.
I mean, I feel like as objective as you can get with cultural analysis, people who do not come from a progressive worldview can listen to a few Lil Nas X songs and be like, okay, this is pretty good. I don't agree with this guy's politics, but I appreciate the song. I can't think of one fucking Tom McDonald song that anyone anywhere is like, all right, objectively, I got to hand it to this guy. That's the fucking, this one's good.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, there's some art out there that sort of like confronts you with its worldview so strongly. And this is even the case for some left-wing art or communist art or whatever.
Yeah.
Like it confronts you with its worldview so strongly that you can't really enjoy it without like being fully on board with like what it's trying to get across. And there's nothing inherently wrong with, you know, making art that tries to make a point in exactly that way. You know, but I mean, if you make it and you produce it and you share it, you do have to understand, like on some level, you probably are going to see like a limited, you know, you're going to see a limitation in terms of who it is received by.
What do you say when people argue that political art is a form of kitsch, that there should not be politics in art whatsoever? I'm personally conflicted about this because I came up with art that had a lot of political subtext. That's a big part of what I liked about it. But there may be limits to this. So, I mean, what is the appropriate role of politics in art?
Yeah, I mean, I think advocating that art should avoid any topic, generally speaking, like broadly speaking, it is just kind of lame. I think that's lame, except for electro swing. You shouldn't like any electro swing.
That's the
like if something's electro swing, just like, you know, as
Yeah.
soon as somebody tells you that, you just dismiss it outright. That's fine. You know, there should genuinely be less electro swing, but like everything else though, you know, I feel like is fine. But yeah, I feel like look, for sure, like making political art is difficult. Because, you know, not only does that require you to put yourself in a position where you're saying or advocating for something that, you know, may automatically turn off some people who don't agree with you, but also in terms of the people that do actually agree with you and what you're saying and align with you ideologically in some way, you're also kind of faced with the difficulty of putting it in such a way to where it's said well and it's advocated for well. And it doesn't come across as just like some dumb sloganeering or whatever, just like super basic. Unfortunately, I feel like there's a lot of people that kind of have the expectation that like, even though this band may align with me ideologically, they didn't say anything that like blew my mind or sort of like, you know, caused me to have a revelation or something, you know, and which I feel like is kind of an unfair expectation to have, especially if you are somebody who's like, politically well read. I mean, while music can be like a really cool avenue into politics and, you know, can kind of put out there some ideas that maybe you hadn't like considered before, I feel like we have to kind of like set our expectations a little bit when it comes to a song. It's not a political dissertation. It's not an article. You know? It's not like a think piece. It's not, you know, and not every song is going to be like, you know, System of a Down prison song where they're like rattling off statistics or whatever.
Isn't one of those guys that is it the bassist or the drummer is a Trump guy now?
I think it's the drummer.
Yeah, and he's like a big anti-vaxxer too.
Yeah, possibly. You know, there's a lot of
I shouldn't
like
spread misinformation. Sorry, but somebody involved is. I read something.
There's like a lot of '90s rock guys who have kind of like fallen, and even people in the punk scene who like sort of like fell into the you know, anti-vax thing. Yeah, and you know, on some level, I just sort of like get it as a mode of personal interest because like a lot of these bands, their lifeblood is like playing these crazy fucking basement shows and stuff like that, or these you know very like nutty DIY scene you know, sort of events. And the thing is like unfortunately, like, you know, COVID put us in a position where we needed to put that on hold. And you know, even if
the same with gym people too.
Yeah, and even if like, you know, all of the information that we were getting at the time, was it correct? Was it fully accurate in terms of like what's the safest things that we could be doing? you as somebody who's just like trying to make rent and you're in some, even like an old school punk band or something like that, you're like, well, what the fuck? I have to like, I still have to pay my bills. It's like the COVID checks only went so far. And, people are still unfortunately like living in a reality where they have things that they have to pay for and afford.
Yeah.
So, I sort of get some people kind of having in the punk scene a hesitancy with like, embracing some of those rules and regulations. But yeah, there's a lot of people in art and music whose kind of views kind of shifted in that direction or toward the right in some way. I mean, Johnny Rotten is like a Trump guy.
I was going to bring him up too.
He's like another dude who loves Trump.
Yeah, I mean, there's something about punk which is like, whatever you tell me to do, I'm going to do the opposite. And if a lot of the media is like Democrat aligned, I understand why those guys take that reactionary stance. It just seems like...
Okay, here's the thing. There are some people who make shocking art and make shocking media with the pure intention of only doing it for shock, and that's it. It's not informed by any kind of like greater understanding of like, okay, so there's like an expectation or something constricting me, telling me like, you shouldn't say this, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't do this.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's natural, especially in a culture such as America, when you see or sort of feel that kind of pressure, you react to it and you react against it. And you're like, no, this is wrong. I shouldn't be being told what to say and what to do and what to or what not to believe.
Right. Liberty.
So I feel like we're kind of like instinctually conditioned through the way that we're taught about our politics and the way our country started to instinctively react in that way and sort of behave that way. And I feel like while that desire isn't inherently wrong, some people are just sort of acting basely off that desire and without actually thinking about what it means or why it's important. Or thinking about like, that source of pressure because you've said X or said Y or done this or done that. Where's that coming from? Is that coming from, a group of people who maybe come from a walk of life where they were hurt or oppressed or abused, and I said something or came across in a way that was insensitive to that experience? Or am I feeling pressure or constriction to say or believe a certain thing because it's funded by a billionaire who's trying to get me to act or condition myself in a certain way to their benefit so they could put more money in their pocket? Or a social or a religious institution that benefits off of people being as kind of clueless or sort of bought into their ideology, as many as possible, so that they could sort of like, put more money into their pockets. Like, you have to sort of like think about where exactly that pressure to say or feel or think a certain thing is coming from. Because if you're not, then you're only working off that baseline sort of like primal instinctual, like, I shouldn't be getting told what to say or think by anybody. I mean, some people are going to tell you what to think and tell you what to say from a place of care and heart and, interest in your own well-being and the well-being of society. Some people are going to be advocating for you to think or act or perceive things in a certain way to your benefit. Like, it's going to come, like, not all of that pressure comes from a bad place. Sometimes it can come from a well-meaning place, from people who actually like have a greater understanding of issues and power hierarchies and so on and so forth. So, unfortunately, I feel like there's a lot of people in art and music who made a career out of sort of like going against the grain in that way socially, without it being informed by much more other than, well, this pisses the greatest amount of people off, so I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
And, I think like there were enough sort of like, things that you could be firing at in that way and without having to think about it, that like it could come across as sort of like genuinely informed by some kind of like left-wing ideology or some sort of like, hope to break apart these power structures so that you see a greater benefit for everybody down the road.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, because that's not the case, you have a guy like Johnny Rotten, who provably was a dude who was doing a lot of what he was doing purely for shock, who now, of course, finds himself in a place where he's like, I kind of like that Trump guy. He says a bunch of stuff that pisses people off. It's like, well, of fucking course, because like that man's whole career is like, I'm going to do a bunch of shit to piss people off. Like, he wasn't satirically and snarkily saying God save the queen because he had a genuine issue with any and all power structures.
Yeah.
And maybe, maybe at this point he's fine with the monarchy. I don't fucking know. You know,
It might be.
like I
Yeah.
have no clue at this point. You know, it seems like with him now and with other people, you know, who are kind of covered in that same cloth, who sort of like, you know, see something good in the way Trump conducts himself. It sort of makes it apparent that there wasn't really anything informing the way that they conducted themselves outside of like, I feel this pressure to not say this and not do that. I'm not thinking about where it's coming from, why it's coming from, to what benefit is it being served if I give into it. I'm not thinking about any of that. I'm just reacting to it because it doesn't feel good. And, you know, I get that it doesn't feel good. It doesn't always feel good, or it doesn't usually feel good, but it requires like a bit of soul searching to, you know, look into yourself and think and say like, you know, am I being told not to say this because I'm hurting somebody, or I'm being insensitive, or I have a lack of perception here outside of my own worldview? Or am I being not to think or feel or say whatever it is, you know, I am, because, you know, there's some kind of like greater network or power structure at play that's trying to force me into a certain position that, you know, keeps society and keeps me at a disadvantage.
I wonder about this period of hyperpolarization, if there's a certain window that opens up in culture, right? As people who are politicized by their involvement with subcultures, music and art and these kinds of fields, that because culture has the capacity to reach across these different divides, if it's a unique opportunity, right? And people are, again, persuadable, whereas in the rest of their lives, they're not going to listen to anyone who, if you come from a blue background, you're not going to listen to anybody who comes from a red background, or so on and so forth. And then you have this music that you enjoy in an apolitical fashion. It's just something that you aesthetically appreciate. And then because you're already in the room, you're receptive to some of these other ideas. And I wonder if it becomes a bridge that kind of opens the door to people. Do we then run the risk of kind of sublimating all of art and aesthetic appreciation and joy and those things that are kind of sublime and intangible to just the inevitable news cycle war of politics? Do we lose something if we allow art to become political?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if an artist is genuinely, or if an artist is genuinely interested in making a political statement with their music, I don't think anything is lost in that process. And I feel like to one degree or another, art has political impacts and implications, even if you're not trying to pack it in there, if you're not trying to work it in there.
Right.
I mean, this will be like a really kind of silly example, but I think on some level, I think inadvertently Sexy Red is maybe one of the most political artists like in the hip hop industry right now.
Inadvertently, how?
Well, I mean, I don't think she's necessarily doing anything that she's doing with her art or with her music in sort of like a radical way. You know, I mean, I don't know how sort of like politically in tune she is, you know, in terms of like right wing or left wing politics. I mean, she's even endorsed both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris at different points, like publicly.
Great. Yeah,
You know, but with that being said, like there's something so deeply social and political about a lot of her music and her music videos and the way she conducts herself, because there are so many pressures and expectations, on a macro level and a micro level, on Black women to conduct themselves in a certain way, do this, do that, do whatever. I mean, you could even say on some level that she too is reacting to like a pressure to confine herself to a certain set of, you know, expectations and norms and so on and so forth. And, you know, a lot of her brand and a lot of her music exists purely just to be like, I'm going to do whatever I want, regardless of how offensive it is or how low you think of me for acting in this way, by being open about my sexuality, by, you know, being raunchy, by being this way or that way or whatever, by, you know, I'm going to do everything I can to not conduct myself in a way that, you know, you perceive as like the right way for a Black woman to conduct herself. And, you know, this is something I'm really only qualified to I wouldn't even say maybe at all, but, you know, there's obviously an extent to which I can comment on this with any accuracy, being a white guy. But, you know, just like looking at it from an outsider's perspective, when you look at her art and when you look at the comment sections, like specifically, like it's a lot of people who are just like, she shouldn't be doing that. You know, it's like she's doing too much, she's degrading herself, she's doing this and she's doing that. And the thing is, like, you know, and again, I can't say like how deep her understanding of like, you know, where all of this coming from draws, you know, how much of it is coming from like conservative points of view, how much is it coming from, you know, a religious point of view. I'm not sure, you know, she has like the metrics on all that or like a full understanding of all of it. But, you know, what is clear is like she's very much reacting to that pressure and doing everything that she can to sort of like push against it and in her own way also advocate for like, you know, look, you don't have to be like me. You don't have to do what I'm doing. But like, you know, let it be known that in the same way that I am, you can do what you want. You know, it's like, don't just de facto give in to expectation X, Y, or Z that you should dress this way or conduct yourself this way or, you know, hide or put down certain aspects of your desires or personality or whatever. Just like, you know, give in to them on some level. That's what I'm doing. Now, you know, I don't know if there are arguments to be made about whether or not the way she conducts herself, is it like the healthiest or most moral or whatever, you know, but the thing is like, you know, morals are a personal choice, you know, they shouldn't necessarily be sort of I think like, you know, kind of like communally enforced in a way that, you know, is detrimental to people's freedom, you know, so long as that you're not hurting anybody else, you know what I mean? If it's like, if it's your life and it's your decisions and the only person who it impacts is you, then you should be the master of, you know, whatever it is that you want to do in terms of like defining yourself or conducting yourself or presenting yourself, whatever, you know, that's your decision. And, you know, I think especially for women, there's not a lot of, or at least like, you know, not until recently, there haven't been a lot of female figures in hip hop advocating for that. A UK punk band that I reviewed recently, Lambrini Girls, I think they've done some great stuff. A New York band that I reviewed recently too, Come Girl 8, I think puts a lot of social politics into their music and art that's very satirical and funny and interesting. Kendrick Lamar, obviously. Though I feel like him as well, with him being as popular as he has been, there's been a lot of discourse around like whether or not what he's saying, is it, you know, radical enough. I mean, it ranges from that to, you know, people who more or less like nominally like agree ideologically with a lot of what he's put out there in his music over the years, but like feel like the corporate bosses decided, well, you know, he's safe. You know, we could put him up there and he'll like, you know, put all this stuff out there in a way that's like coded and leaves people feeling like, yeah, that was, you know, my ideology put out there. And,
I mean,
and
we
as a
used
result,
to think about this as part of like the purpose of doing art is that, okay, there were necessarily these investors, you had to get the money from somewhere, and then you'd find like creative ways to like Trojan horse your politics into whatever art you were making that was visible to the audience, but not to the donors. You're like, all right, that's a successful piece. That was like, I think explicitly the point of a lot of art that I was interested in when I was young, because it was radical. That's what was exciting about it. And
no, it's true. And the thing is like, what I feel like a lot of the people who have that type of criticism are kind of like failing to realize is that even if, you know, there wasn't any sort of like higher up approving or not approving on whether or not sort of like Kendrick was there, he still would have to find a way to sort of like mitigate that message in a way to where it appealed to the widest amount of people. He still has to sort of like mix it with something in some way so that it's sort of like, you know, listenable and palatable to millions of people. You know, I mean, even before we had any sort of discourse about whether or not Kendrick is radical enough, he still had to make his anti-drinking substance abuse anthem Swimming Pools sound like a drinking song in order to get people to listen to it. You know what I mean? Like nobody was going to sit there, even people who sort of like, you know, have a history of alcoholism or think that, you know, obviously getting that deep into substances is probably bad for you. Even people who feel that way are not going to sit through just some like, you know, just straight up boom bap song where it's like nothing but bars. It's like, yeah, drinking is bad. Don't drink. Drinking is the worst thing that you could do. Like nobody wants to sit through that. So as a result, like as you just said, like you have to kind of go back to those basics of like, I need to find a way to get this message that I care about worked into my music in such a way to where it still functions as a music piece. And that's the thing. I feel like a lot of people sort of like fail to realize that like all this stuff needs to still function as music.
Yeah.
Because, you know,
Sure.
if it doesn't, really all that you end up left with is like, you know, some kind of version of like Tom McDonald, but it's telling you it's telling you a message that you agree with instead. You know, the thing, see, here's the thing. I wouldn't want to listen to fucking Tom McDonald, even if he was telling me every single thing that I think. Like, if Tom McDonald agreed with me on every single thing that I think and feel, I still wouldn't want to fucking listen to Tom McDonald because the music sucks ass. So, I mean, while while part of it is most definitely like, yeah, I don't agree with anything that he says. Even if he was even if he was literally calling me on the phone to be like, hey, can you tell me every single thing that you think and believe so I could work it into a song? I still would not want to fucking listen to it. So all of this stuff still needs to work as music, you know, like even if it's something that you agree with, you don't want to feel dictated to, you know, in a piece of art that you're consuming.
Right.
And, you know, honestly, like for those who feel like what Kendrick did wasn't like revolutionary enough, if that's what your view of yourself is like, you know, a person who believes in a certain politic or sort of like follows politics, but the only thing stopping you from like, you know, fully going in that direction is like whether or not a multimillionaire rapper is up on a stage at the Super Bowl telling you to do it right then and there, you're not a fucking revolutionary. You know what I mean? If like, if the go that you're waiting for is like Kendrick Lamar at the Super Bowl, like, I'm sorry, there's nothing like revolutionary about the action that you think that you may be ready to take. You know, it's like you don't need, you know, approval from Kendrick Lamar to do X or Y or Z, you know, and nor is the Super Bowl the place, honestly, that, you know, were somebody like him to say the word go, what would have happened? Would all of the white boomers like run down and flooded the field and sort of like, you know, taken Donald Trump and crucified him? Like, no, that would not have happened.
Yeah, I think music is a great place to get started with politics, but it's not a place to get fully educated or organized or anything like that.
No, it's not. It's a great way to sort of like validate feelings and sort of like spread the word. And I feel like art and music is a really great way to sort of like communicate the restlessness and the pain and the injustices that some people can feel at the hand of certain types of experiences. But like, as you just said, it's not an education on like how to fix those things, the root cause of all those things. Again, there are rare instances where like Prison Song, it's like literally like all of these stats and explanations and statistics. But the thing is like, you can't work that formula every time over and over and over, or else you just end up with a bunch of metal songs with ranty spoken word. You know, it's like part of the reason that song works is because there's no other song out there like it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, imagine, would that song have taken off or been maybe sort of like as eye-widening as to a lot of people as it has been if there were 500 more that sounded exactly the same? No, you know, probably not. So the thing is, again, I feel like for a lot of artists, the position that they're stuck in, unfortunately, even, you know, if there isn't some kind of like, you know, label or corporate overlord over them deciding what they should or shouldn't put into their music, is that they do have to worry on some level about like, okay, I want to convey something. I want to bring a message. I want to communicate something. But what I'm creating here, because it is a piece of music, it still has to be orally and melodically and rhythmically pleasing or appealing in some way, so that a general audience wants to consume it. That is, if that's even what you want to do. Some people like to, you know, and rightfully so, make politically geared and motivated art that's really harsh, you know, and as a way to sort of reflect on the darkness of the content of the music. And that's fine. And that's like, you know, there's nothing wrong with that either. I'm not sort of like dictating here, like what's the best or most ideal way to make art or get a message across. But, you know, artists who engage in that sort of thing already understand on some level, like I'm making noise music. Like there's going to be a very niche audience for that sort of thing. All I'm saying here is like, depending on what you do or what you want to get across, be ready to make certain types of sacrifices potentially in terms of who may or may not want to listen to it.
Anthony Fantano, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on.